Okay, sir, I guess we should start the session.
Yeah, we could start. Yeah.
Yes, sir. A very good morning to all of you. This is Varun Kumar, founder of Law Audience and Law Audience Journal. I welcome to all of you. Today we are organizing a webinar on the topic of international humanitarian law and non-international armed conflicts. Today we have with us Mr. Atul Alexander. So let me introduce to all of you to our honorable guest. Mr. Atul Alexander completed his LLB from School of Excellence in Law and LLM from Tamil Nadu Dr. Ambedkar Law University. He was a gold medalist and a university topper both at LLB and LLM level. Mr. Atul Alexander is presently working as an assistant professor of law at West Bengal National University of Judicial Sciences. And Mr. Atul Alexander is also selected as a visiting research scholar at the prestigious Stockholm Center for International Law, US Naval War College, United States. Mr. Atul Alexander has written extensively on international law, and some of his works were cited by New York Times, South China Morning Post, etc. Further, he has judged several prestigious moot courts, which includes the JSF Indonesia and Egypt national rounds and the Stetson India rounds quarterfinals, Howard Smith Free Hills corporate law moot, etc. He has authored a chapter for 12th CBSE legal education, that is international on international law, which was published by EBC Publications. He has also participated in international conferences in Indonesia, Philippines, China, etc., to name some. Currently, Mr. Atul Alexander is part of a major research project on the collaborative engagement for research, training and development in handling of chemical and hazardous waste. Eastern region partner, the project is undertaken in collaboration with the Ministry of Environment and Forest and National Law School of India University, Bangalore. Mr. Atul Alexander is also pursuing his PhD on the topic of the concept of a preemptory norm in journal international law. So before I hand over it to our honorable speaker, I would like to give some general instruction to all the attendees. Like if any one of you want to ask any question, so please don't ask it in between the session. You can ask your questions at the end of the session in the chat box or by raising your hand. So if any participant want to turn on his video, he or she can do so, but make sure you are sitting in a good manner. So now I would like to request to our honorable speaker, please continue the session.
Firstly, I would like to thank Varun for this kind introduction and providing me with a platform to discuss on a very germane topic in international law per se, that is international humanitarian law and non-international armed conflict. So before stepping into the topic, I would like to give a brief overview of where international humanitarian law stands in the larger realm of international law. So, as you know, international law regulates the conduct of states, and there are certain principles that states have to adhere, failing which states would have to bear what you call a state responsibility. And international law, humanitarian law, comes as one of the branches of international law that only regulates war. And international humanitarian law is also called as law of warfare, and it only regulates the conduct of war. And this is somewhat paradoxical considering the fact that in international law, one of the cardinal principle is non-use of force, and use of force is outlawed under Article 2, Para 4 of the UN Charter. But here is a branch of law, which is a subset of international law, which says war has to be regulated and war is not outlawed. So this is a kind of paradox I see, a kind of interplay between international humanitarian law and international law. So the basic object of international humanitarian law is to regulate the conduct of war. It does not say war has to be prohibited or use of force is prohibited. Secondly, the major the role played by international humanitarian law is to limit the suffering caused by war. So there are various institutions under international humanitarian law which aids and assist in mitigating the sufferings caused by war. A classic example of this would be ICRC, that is the International Committee on Red Cross, which works under the auspice of international humanitarian law that assist and consults the state with regard to wartime situation. So in a sense, what the perspective or the perception that we get is international humanitarian law is a kind of a regulatory regime that regulates the conduct of state. And ultimately, the masters in international humanitarian law is states. So they decide what force to be used. They decide what methods and means of war has to be employed in battlefield, etc. So this is one of the challenges that international humanitarian law is at present confronting, and which has to be addressed. So in a way, international humanitarian law is a fine balance between humanity and military necessity. These are very important terms in the parlance of IHL, or international humanitarian law. So international humanitarian law tries to strike a balance between humanity on the one hand and military necessity on the other hand. So having laid the background of what international humanitarian law means, now I'll go into the corpus of law which regulates the conduct of war. So when I say corpus of law, there are two kinds of laws which regulate international humanitarian law. That is the Hague laws. The other is the Geneva laws. So Hague law, we have two important conventions, that 1899 and the 1907 convention, that is the Hague Conventions, which regulates the methods and means of warfare. So Hague law basically underscores the point that there are certain weapons and means of warfare that is prohibited, and states should not use certain weapons during warfare. On the other hand, you have a corpus or body of law, which is the Geneva laws, which says there are certain categories of persons which are who are protected under international humanitarian law. This might include the civilians. This includes medical personnel, journalists who cover the war field, etc. These personnel are prohibited, and these personnel should not be an object of attack during wartime. Now, to put it short, international humanitarian law is further classified into two. One is international armed conflict, or international armed conflict, or the other part is the non-international armed conflict. International armed conflict basically regulates the conduct between two states. Let's say India and Pakistan, assuming India and Pakistan are engaged in a war. This is regulated by international armed conflict. Non-international armed conflict regulates the conduct between the state on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have various kinds of adversary within the state. So international armed conflict essentially is an armed conflict that happens between two states. Non-international armed conflict happens within the state, between the state and the belligerent or a kind of national liberation movement. So international humanitarian law regulates both international armed conflict as well as non-international armed conflict. And the laws which govern international humanitarian law is the Geneva law and the Hague laws. Hague law, which concerns the means and methods of warfare, and the Geneva law, which essentially talks about the protection of certain categories of persons, like let's say POWs, prisoners of war. They are protected under humanitarian law. They should not be an object of attack. So I'll give a simple example to make you understand. So recently, Pakistan had captured Abhinandan, right? When Pakistan captured Abhinandan, under international humanitarian law, he would be treated as prisoner of war. So prisoner of war under the Third Geneva Convention is guaranteed certain protection, which if states violate would be in violation of international humanitarian law obligation. So that is a classic example of prisoners of war, how prisoners of war is protected under international humanitarian law. Now, to invoke international humanitarian law, there are certain conditions or thresholds that has to be met. Firstly, there has to be an armed conflict in existence. Armed conflict is a very important criteria that has to exist for for IHL to be operational. This is somewhat, I would say, this is somewhat ironical, because during wartime, the applicable law would be international humanitarian law. International human rights law, which is another branch of law, would not be applicable during wartime. So the application of international humanitarian law begins when there is an armed conflict. Now, the challenge in modern international humanitarian law is, how do you prove the existence of an armed conflict? There is no criteria that is prescribed under the Geneva Convention, which talks about the conditions that has to be met before a conflict is termed as an armed conflict. So you have one specific case in the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, the ICTY. Now, I will discuss the contours of international criminal tribunals and the hybrid tribunals which were established post World War II. But this was one tribunal that was established in the early 1990s to look into the violations that happened in the Balkans. So the court had jurisdiction to the extent of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So my point here is, in one of the cases in the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, the case of prosecutor versus Tadic. This is a very important case when it comes to international criminal law, and it has, in modern terms, has juxtaposed with international humanitarian law. This particular case defined the term armed conflict. In the context of international humanitarian law, armed conflict is very important. Only if armed conflict is established, the provisions of international humanitarian law could be invoked. So this particular case laid down the threshold, the minimum threshold that has to be met before a conflict can be categorized as an armed conflict. If that threshold is not met, the conflict states would claim the defense of riot. State would say it's not an armed conflict. Hence the provisions of international humanitarian law would not be applicable. And it's a sporadic act. It's a riot which happens within the state. So to ensure that protection of international humanitarian law is applied, one has to first establish the fact that it's an armed conflict, right? That's very important. And the second point I'm trying to drive home is, in modern international humanitarian law, there is a very little difference between international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict. This distinction that you make between international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict is only for the sake of academic discourse. But in reality or in practice, every conflict that you see today has an international element to it. So when I discuss a topic as non-international armed conflict, you need to understand the fact that it does not preclude the operation of provisions of international armed conflict. For instance, in case of Syria is a classic case to show that it's a classic case of non-international armed conflict, but with the involvement of countries like United States and Russia into the conflict has essentially become an international armed conflict. So my proposition here is, no conflict that you see today is non-international conflict. Every conflict has an international element to it. It has an international character to it. So every conflict that you see today is international armed conflict. The distinction that you find in academic literature, I think it's getting bridged, and it's blurred in a way, right? So as I pointed out, international humanitarian law protects certain categories of persons. It regulates certain means and methods of warfare. When I say means and method of warfare, there are certain weapons that are prohibited. For instance, chemical weapons cannot be used during warfare. There are specific conventions for that. Convention on chemical weapons. Use of biological weapons are prohibited. So this basically would ensure that war happens in a humane way. This, in a way, I feel is a limitation to humanitarian law, because humanitarian law does not prohibit or outlaw war. So unlike general international law. So this itself is a kind of limitation on the practice of international humanitarian law. Now, there are two kinds of categories under international humanitarian law, that, as I pointed out, apart from the nature of the conflict. That is, one group is combatant. Combatants are the persons who are the members of armed forces. They are members of militia, they are voluntary corps, etc. So the combatants are given certain kinds of protection under international humanitarian law. The other kind of personnel who are categorized as combatants are resistance movement. This is very important. In non-international armed conflict, on the one hand, you have the state. On the other hand, you have an entity that is fighting against the state within the state. So states would automatically say that the group that is fighting against the state is a terrorist organization, it's a belligerent, is insurgent. But there are certain entities under international humanitarian law whose rights are protected. For instance, the entity which fights for liberation, which fights for liberating from the atrocious or heinous acts of the state. So national liberation movements are protected under international humanitarian law. But the problem here is, how do you distinguish a national liberation movement which is fighting for independence from a group which is essentially a non-state actor, essentially a group that is a terrorist organization? So this is one of the challenges that is haunting international humanitarian law. On the one hand, you say that liberation movements or the groups are protected under international humanitarian law. On the other hand, you say terrorism has to be prohibited. Now, how do you distinguish a national liberation movement and a terrorist organization? So this is where there is a very important provision under the Geneva Convention, Additional Protocol 1. Now, you need to remember that when I say Additional Protocol 1 and Additional Protocol 2 to the Geneva Convention, the entire body of Geneva law is comprised of 4 Geneva Conventions. And these 4 Geneva Conventions essentially talk about various subject matters. Geneva Convention, for instance, 3 talks about prisoners of war. Geneva Convention 4 talks about the protection of civilians. So these 4 Geneva Convention essentially protects various categories of persons. In addition to the Geneva Conventions, which was signed in the year 1949, there are 2 additional protocols, Additional Protocol 1 and Additional Protocol 2. Additional Protocol 1 essentially covers international armed conflict. Additional Protocol 2 it covers non-international armed conflict, which is a topic of discussion today. Now, now I'm telling you the position with regard to India. Now, before going into the position taken by India with regard to Geneva Convention, it's very important to understand or underscore this point. When Geneva Convention was signed, there were no third world countries. Now, Geneva Convention was signed in the year 1949, right? Most of the countries which were involved in the drafting process of the Geneva Convention were the Western powers. There were very few third world countries which took part in the drafting of the Geneva Convention. But the position is different with regard to Additional Protocol, which supplements the 4 Geneva Convention. So India, although is a signatory to the Geneva Convention, is not signatory to the Additional Protocol of the Geneva Convention. I'll tell you the precise reason why India has not signed the Additional Protocol. But the point here is, when Geneva Convention was signed, there were no third world countries. This is a point that needs to be noted, because most of the African states got independence only post 1960 because of the decolonization process. So whether it would be apt to say that Geneva Conventions are universal, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with the fact that Geneva Convention is universal, although there are a lot of countries who are signatories. Because in the drafting history of the Geneva Convention, there were hardly few handful of third world countries. Now, the first category of person that is protected under the Geneva Convention are the combatants who are given this POW status, prisoners of war status. The other category of persons who are protected under the Geneva Convention are civilians. And civilians should not be the object of attack. This is a very important principle that is codified under the provision 4th Geneva Convention, Article 50, which says that civilian objects and civilians should not be the object of attack. So this is codified as I said in the Geneva Conventions. So essentially, there are 2 subject matters when it comes to international humanitarian law. On the one hand, you are the combatant. On the other hand, you have civilians, and civilians are protected all the time, right? Civilians are given some basic protection at every point in time. Now, international humanitarian law, along with the codified provisions under the Geneva Convention, has certain principles. And this is popularly called as the principles of IHL, the principles of international humanitarian law. For instance, when my students prepare for the Henry Dunant Moot, so I tell them that you need to increasingly rely on these principles, because principles in a sense make up the corpus of international law. Because international law, as you know, is highly decentralized and informal. So if you argue based on principles, that can create a binding effect to some extent. Now, there are certain principles that needs to be looked into when I talk about international humanitarian law. The first is neutrality, the principle of humanity, the principle of impartiality, the principle of proportionality. These are some of the common principles that is associated with international humanitarian law, and states have to follow these principles, and they are bound because some of these principles have attained the status of customary international law. And as you all know, if a principle attains the status of customary international law, states are bound by the principle irrespective of treaty obligation. So for more clarity, you can maybe read the North Sea Continental Shelf case. This is a very important case in the docket of International Court of Justice, where the elements of customary international law was laid down. But the other point that I find unique in the corpus of international humanitarian law is the reference to the peremptory norms principle. There are a lot of principles in international humanitarian law which has attained the status of jus cogens. Jus cogens are basically a higher norm which states can never violate. Of course, you have exceptions to customary law, but with regard to jus cogens, there can never be a violation. So the point here is, law of war, international humanitarian law, is a branch of law that regulates the conduct of war, and this regulation happens through Geneva law and Hague law, right? So this is a point that is very clear, and supplementing these conventions, there are 3-4 important provisions that states have to be mindful of. Now, coming to the core of my discussion today, that is non-international armed conflict. Now, as I pointed out, in modern jus gentium or international law, there cannot be a distinction between non-international armed conflict and international armed conflict, because every conflict that you see today is internationalized. So every conflict, in an essence, is an international armed conflict. Now, I'll give you an example with regard to India. Let's say there is an armed rebellion which is fighting against the government of India. Let's say it takes up arm demanding a separate state, and the government says it's a terrorist organization, so this will not be covered by international humanitarian law. But the other states like Pakistan would say they are fighting for liberation, so protection under international humanitarian law should be applicable to them. So this is a kind of dichotomy that you see in case of Kashmir. In Kashmir, India would say the group that is fighting against the government is a terrorist organization. Hence, international humanitarian law ceases to apply. On the other hand, Pakistan would say people in Kashmir are fighting for liberation. Hence, the provisions of international humanitarian law would apply. So how do you reconcile this dichotomy? This is one of the challenges that is faced by international legal jurists and academia. The problem is further compounded by the fact that international humanitarian law or international law per se does not define the term terrorism. This is a very important concept that you need to take on board. That is, international law, although you have various conventions on terrorism. For instance, there's a Tokyo Convention which talks about prohibition of hijacking of aircraft. These are sectorial conventions, but a universal convention, a foolproof convention, an overarching convention which defines the term terrorism is something that is missing in international law. So it becomes really tough to draw a line to distinguish a terrorist group from a group which is fighting for freedom or liberation. And this is a problem that I've seen in various kinds of battles. For instance, the genocide which happened in Sri Lanka, the massive genocide which happened in Sri Lanka in 2009, where the Sri Lankan government was accused of committing war crimes. Now, the Sri Lankan government would say the so-called LTT, that is the Tamil Liberation Movement, that is fighting against the state, is a terrorist organization. So essentially, IHL won't be applicable. The international law community would see LTT as a group that is fighting for liberation. Now, what I'm trying to say here is there has to be a distinction made between non-state actor on the one hand, that is terrorist group, and this armed non-state armed forces. Now, non-state armed forces are somewhat regulated and they are governed by the principles of international humanitarian law. For more clarity, you can read the Additional Protocol 1, Article 1, Para 4 of the Additional Protocol 1, which lays down what are the criteria for a liberation movement. So national liberation movement which fights against the state, the so-called sovereign state, which is a mammoth entity in itself, has to be given certain kinds of protection, right? So for instance, how do you decide a group is a liberation movement from a non-state actor? So there are certain criteria. Maybe you could take this down. Firstly, there has to be a command structure. When there is a command structure in place, a group can be said to be organized, and you could term that group as a national liberation movement. Secondly, it has to have the common support of the people. Thirdly, the group has to have a distinct sign or an emblem. For instance, the LTT had a separate territory. It had a separate television channel in the northeastern part of Sri Lanka. So going by the definition of the resistance movement or an organized group that is fighting for liberation, LTT perfectly fits into that category. So when Sri Lankan government says they are essentially a terrorist group who have committed, enormous amount of suicide attacks in Sri Lanka, I would disagree with that, because LTT fall under the category of resistance movement, and they fall under the category of the definition of resistance movement. But unfortunately, these definitions that I point out are the definitions that I borrow from the International Criminal Tribunal, the ad hoc tribunals from Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, or the recently established tribunal in Bangladesh. But there is no codified definition of what constitutes non-state actor under the 4th Geneva Convention. So none of the Geneva Convention defines what is a non-state actor. So what are the rules or laws that applies to non-state actor? There is no clarity on that. Of course, you have a lot of UNGA resolutions, but UNGA resolutions are not binding per se. So as I pointed out, there has to be a distinction made between combatants and civilians. So civilians are protected round the clock, whether it's war or peacetime. Combatants are protected under the provisions of the Geneva Convention. Now, the point I want to stress here is, again, with regard to Sri Lanka. Now, how do you enforce international humanitarian law? This is something that one needs to ask. Is there a dispute settlement body which is present in the Geneva Convention which enforces international humanitarian law? Unfortunately, no. There is no supervisory authority under international humanitarian law which can enforce the certain rights when states are in abjugation of this right. So that is one of the weakness or limitations on international humanitarian law. So essentially, international humanitarian law relies on international criminal law to enforce the violations under international humanitarian law. So in a way, international humanitarian law is something like an acquired jurisprudence. This is a very important term when I talk about the philosophy of international law. When I say international law, every branch of international law is connected. You cannot see international humanitarian law in an isolation. International humanitarian law has a nexus with human rights law. Now, I'll come to that part of discussion. When can you apply human rights law in wartime? Whether human rights law can be applied in wartime, or whether human rights law can be only applied during peacetime. So this is something that has been extensively debated. And if you read articles in the European Journal of International Law, you will come across a kind of differing thought process with regard to the application of human rights law with regard to humanitarian. My point is, no branch of international law can stand in isolation. This is applicable to WTO. When I said the dispute settlement body in WTO, recently WTO in one of its judgments had applied the principles of treaty interpretation under Article 31 of the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, which is essentially a principle that is borrowed from general international law. And WTO has a World Trade Organization dispute settlement body has also applied the principles of customary law, which is also unique to a branch like WTO. So we are moving out of a regime that is self-contained, and we are seeing a kind of cross-fertilization of regimes in international. And international humanitarian law as a branch is not left out. And it has an influence of international criminal law. In fact, you will be surprised to know that international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions talk about refugees' right. Now, people see refugee law as a distinct branch altogether. But refugee law has to be seen in the backdrop of war, right? War, it is the offshoot of war that results in the inflow and outflow of refugees, right? So international humanitarian law even addresses the concerns of refugees. So the refugee law and international humanitarian law have to be reconciled. So the challenge that is presented today is how do you reconcile these branches of law, which post globalization has become more fragmented. This is where one needs to read a lot on what you call as fragmentation of international law, right? Fragmentation of international law, the challenges that arise out of fragmenting the nature of international law. So when I say international humanitarian law, when I miss out on international criminal law, when I only teach you something on international humanitarian law, I'm really missing the bus. So I feel that humanitarian law as a branch has to be taught along with criminal law, human rights law, and refugee law. Now, coming to the foundational question that I posed, how do you enforce international humanitarian law? There is no supervisory body under humanitarian law regime. Although one might say that ICRC is the nodal agency which regulates humanitarian law, but the problem is ICRC, the International Committee on Red Cross, is an intergovernmental agency that only gives advice to the states. It does not have a kind of supervisory authority as the Human Rights Committee. Under the Human Rights Law, you have the Human Rights Committee that can question the state, and states have to submit periodic reports, right? Unlike that, you do not have a system in place or a template or a roadmap when it comes to international humanitarian law. So this is one of the weaknesses of international humanitarian law, and this weakness is applicable both for the international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict. So essentially, humanitarian law is clubbed with international criminal law. So when I say there are cases that is brought up in the International Criminal Court, what you call as the ICC, which was established in the year 2008. I mean, it's interesting when I talk about an International Criminal Court. It's only yesterday that US was accusing ICC for nepotism and has enforced what you call as economic sanctions on ICC. That is quite ironical. And people say International Criminal Court or the Rome Statute is a very weak structure in enforcing international humanitarian law. Apart from that, international humanitarian law is enforced at the domestic level. When I say domestic level, I could give the example of India. In India, we have a specific act to enforce the Geneva Convention, that is the Geneva Convention Act. This act was ratified in the Parliament of India in the year 1960, the Geneva Convention Act. But one of the problems that I see with this act is a case can only be brought by the government. An individual or a citizen cannot bring a case against any entity. It can be only brought by the executive. So there are two means by which international humanitarian law is enforced. One through the domestic framework. The other is through setting up of tribunals as what we have seen across the globe, right? The tribunals that is set up in Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, now recently in Bangladesh, for trying for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So now coming to the aspect of India and international humanitarian law. This is something that I thought of discussing because this is something that is close to my heart. When the Geneva Convention was signed in the year 1949, India played a very, very active role in the signing of the Geneva Convention. But the overall irony of that is there were very few third world countries, as I pointed out. Subsequent to the Geneva Convention, there were two additional protocols, that is Additional Protocol 1 and 2, which was signed in the year 1977. India did not ratify the Additional Protocol 1 and 2. Now, interestingly, there was a question that was posed to the parliament as to why India has not signed this very germane document which governs international humanitarian law. And if you see the response of one of the parliamentarian, it would be a kind of mockery. The response that was given was, the Geneva Convention does not have a provision for, the Additional Protocol 1 does not have a provision for reservations. Now, it's very important to know that most of the states have signed various multilateral or bilateral treaties because there would be reservations clause where certain provisions under the treaty regime is excluded from application for that particular state. Now, the Geneva Convention and the Additional Protocol 1 to be precise, does not have a provision for reservations. So India says this convention do not have a provision for reservation. So we cannot reserve certain provisions which affect our national interest. So India is not a signatory to the Additional Protocol 1. This is quite ironical considering the fact that India has signed the ICCPR. India has signed the ICCPR, but it has reserved Article 1 of ICCPR, which talks about internal right to self-determination. This is quite ironical because ICCPR also does not provide a provision for reservation, right? So India saying that, stating that the additional protocol 1 does not have a reservation clause, it's quite ludicrous. That is what I feel. And the second argument given by India is, under the Geneva Convention, there is something called as International Fact-Finding Commission. This is something that I missed out when I was discussing on the enforcement of international humanitarian law, the International Fact-Finding Commission. So to put it precise, or to put it in a simple term, when there is a violation that happens in a state, the UN establishes a fact-finding commission, and the fact-finding commission goes to the respective states and does an investigation, right? Now, this particular investigation process essentially takes away the sovereignty of the state. So India feels that by having a provision which talks about International Fact-Finding Commission, you are abjugating the sovereignty of the state. But again, the issue in hand here is, International Fact-Finding Commission only works with the consent of the state. So India saying that although there's an International Fact-Finding Commission, this is quite paradoxical, because this is always bound by the consent of the state again. Now, with regard to Sri Lanka, again, I'm coming to the Sri Lankan case study, because Sri Lankan case study is a classic example of non-international armed conflict. So with regard to Sri Lanka, the international community wanted to establish an International Fact-Finding Commission under the recommendation of the then Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon. But this process was halted by the then president, the former president of Sri Lanka, Mahinda Rajapakse. And when Sirisena took over, post Rajapakse, Sirisena wanted to establish a tribunal to look into the war crimes that happened in the year 2009. But the present Sri Lankan government, under the leadership of Gotabaya Rajapakse, is one of the relatives of Rajapakse, has been very critical of any kind of investigation into the war crimes that happened in Sri Lanka. So again, this prompts me to take you to a different zone altogether, to emphasize on the role of international politics. This is a very important point that I want to drive home today, because international politics has a larger role to play in how international law is applied. And if you read the works of Martin Koskonami, Hans Morgenthau, they would have said international law is nothing but a subsidiary of international politics, right? And I would ask you or suggest you to read a book by Martin Koskonami, a Finnish scholar. He has written a beautiful work on the politics of international law. So in a way, international humanitarian law operates in a politically charged environment. So although we have 600 provisions in place, the implementation or the enforcement of international humanitarian law is a very, very tough proposition. That is because at the forefront, you have the state, who is the major actor in the implementation of international humanitarian law. States determine when there is an armed conflict. States determine when there is an end to an armed conflict, etc. So the major actors in international humanitarian law are the states, right? So as I pointed out, when international humanitarian law applies, it applies only during armed conflict. And armed conflict is something that it has a very higher threshold. Now, the other question, that it's an open question that I want to pose to everyone: when does an armed conflict commence, and when does an armed conflict ends? This is a very important question to ask, because only when there is an armed conflict that kicks in, or when there is a triggering of armed conflict, does the provision of international humanitarian law applies, right? And only when an armed conflict ends, the provisions of human rights law apply. So how do you reconcile human rights and humanitarian law? So some scholars say human rights law and humanitarian law should be applied. Human rights should be applied at every possible time. Even if it's an armed conflict, human rights does not cease. Because the ultimate object of both these branches of law is to protect the larger interest of human values, is to protect what you call as the rights of the humanity, right? So there is a common merging point between human rights law and humanitarian law. So this commonality would mean that human rights law should be applied during armed conflict. There cannot be something like a lex specialist. You cannot say this is a special law that should be applied during armed conflict. So what I feel is there has to be a kind of a cooperative approach when one applies human rights law to humanitarian law. Now, I'll tell you something. There are a lot of provisions under the Geneva Convention which directly refers to human rights law. And one provision that is striking is the Martens Clause. This is a very important provision under the Hague Regulations. Hague Regulations of 1899 and 1907, which talks about the Martens Clause. Martens Clause basically says that when there is a provision that is not covered under international humanitarian law, the principle of conscience and dictate of reason would continue to apply. So this is one provision which indicates the fact that there is an association or affinity of international humanitarian law with human rights law. The other common feature that I see here is states are very reluctant to apply human rights law in the time of armed conflict. This is because states know that international humanitarian law is structured, and when human rights law is applied in armed conflict, states would be taken or made accountable. Unlike when only humanitarian law applies, when humanitarian law applies, when there is a state which violates humanitarian law, the law that kicks in is international criminal law. But international criminal law again is fraught with deficiencies and loopholes. For instance, I'll give you an example of India. India is not a signatory to the International Criminal Code. Now, one might ask whether the head of the state can be brought under International Criminal Code. And you need to understand the distinction between International Court of Justice and International Criminal Code. International Court of Justice takes up only cases pertaining to states, whereas International Criminal Court take up cases involving individuals, especially who are heads of states. So now let's say, assuming that the former head of state in India committed crimes against humanity or genocide. Now, whether the former head of the state can be tried in International Criminal Court with regard to India, it's not possible because India has not signed the International Criminal, the Rome Statute, or the statute of the International Criminal Court. Now, there are various reasons, political as well as apolitical reasons, why India has not signed the Rome Statute. So only if India signs the Rome Statute, strictly speaking, even if there is a violation that is committed by the government, that the state can be indicted under the violations of international humanitarian law. So I'll tell you the reasons why India has not signed the Rome Statute. Firstly, India says the Rome Statute does not have any provision for reservations. That is one. Second important reason why India has not signed the Rome Statute, because the Rome Statute does not talk about terrorism. Now, India is embroiled in, when it comes to discussions on terrorism, India takes a very affirmative stand, right? But the Rome Statute does not talk anything about terrorism, because India wanted a provision under the Rome Statute which discusses the definition and the scope of terrorism. But Rome Statute only talks about 4 kinds of crime: crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and crimes of aggression. So India wanted a provision on terrorism. Terrorism was not incorporated. Hence, India says we are not willing to be part of Rome Statute. So now, assuming that the government of India commits any kind of, let's say, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, the ICC will not have jurisdiction. ICC will not have jurisdiction because India has not signed the Rome Statute. This can also be applied in case of China. Let's say states want to bring China for whatever COVID violation that it has done, although it does not fit into the definitional fabric. But assuming that the definition is stretched and states want to bring China before the ICC, it's not possible. Practically, it's not possible because for 2 reasons. One, China is a member of the Security Council. So even if a matter is referred through a Security Council resolution, China would veto it, right? It has the vetoing power, and veto blocks any kind of procedural forwarding. And secondly, China is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. So in a way, states have hijacked the enforcement of international humanitarian law. This is what I want to say. There are violations that are happening across the globe. Let's say one which I can now remember is the atrocities happening in Yemen. In case of Yemen, the UN has termed the violations that is happening in Yemen is one of the worst humanitarian law crisis. But whether there's a court established in Yemen to prosecute the warlords, no, because the larger picture is you have international politics, right? This is where I would like to again bring to your attention the contribution of Martin Koskonomi, wherein he says international politics is the larger picture of international law. International law only justifies international politics. So this is the point that I want to drive home. And again, states have used national security. Again, states have used national security to violate human rights. States are very reluctant to invoke IHL to violate human rights because IHL would mean there are certain obligations. So states say it's a matter of national security. It has not elevated to the position of an armed conflict, so IHL won't apply. Now, I would like to, in the final portion of my presentation, I would like to flag some modern challenges. I mean, one of the challenges that I see in modern international law is asymmetric warfare. This is something that is very important and discussed across the board. Now, when I say asymmetric warfare, on the one hand, you have the state. On the other hand, you have non-state actor, which is fighting for liberation. So if you see the balance of power or the balance of power between these two entities, it is totally fitted in favor of the state, pitted in the favor of the state. So what will happen is states can override firstly the provisions of IHL, international humanitarian law. Secondly, what could happen is states themselves could interpret international humanitarian law because there is no body which interprets international humanitarian law. It's a state which interprets international humanitarian law. Non-state actor, a group that is fighting for liberation, is rarely provided an opportunity to have their saying in international humanitarian law or during wartime, right? So what I feel is it's a kind of asymmetric warfare that we are seeing today, wherein the balance of power is totally loaded in favor of state. So there has to be a balance of power, and for this to happen, there has to be an emphasis on international cooperation. This is a very important term I often see in the parlance of international environmental law. In settlement of dispute, international cooperation plays a very important role. When it comes to non-international armed conflict, it is more the case because on the one hand, you are non-state actor which is fighting for their own cause, which is just. On the other hand, you have a state which is a kind of monster because of its armed powers and etc. So there has to be a balance of power when you talk about international humanitarian law. The second is the enforcement procedure under humanitarian law has to be streamlined. So what I feel is there has to be an international humanitarian law court, like what you have for ICC or the Rome Statute, right? Rome Statute, there is a court. There has to be a court instead of a fact-finding commission, which can make the state accountable for whatever atrocities or egregious violation that it has committed. This is an analogy that can also be stretched to refugee law. Refugee law does not have a dispute settlement body, right? Refugee law is enforced only at the national courts. Let's say there's a violation of international refugee law. The Supreme Court of India decides the case. When you have a situation where some of the judges, I'm not pointing out all the judges, have a very, very limited conceptual scholarship on international refugee law, they interpret the provisions of refugee law. So I'm not pointing out, I mean, all the judges, but there are the major portion of the judges in the Supreme Court have very limited understanding of refugee law, international refugee law, which is very complex and which encompasses the interplay of various branches of law and which requires very intricate interpretation. So what I feel is there has to be a different dispute settlement body. The third suggestion is the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocol has to be amended to meet the modern requirement. The modern requirement is this: cyber warfare. We talk about cyber warfare, right? The use of drones during armed conflict. Now, international humanitarian law does not have any provision which addresses these challenges. So, for instance, use of drone attack, use of artificial intelligence. Now, in case of artificial intelligence, how do you fix responsibility, right? When there is an absence of command sovereign, there's no command involved. It's autonomous weapon. It acts on its own, right? So how does international humanitarian law cope with the changing technology? This is something that needs to be looked into. The final point that I would like to highlight here is, and this is a very important point, is there has to be this branch of humanitarian law should not be seen in silos, or this branch has to be not seen in a compartmentalized manner. International humanitarian law has to be interpreted in the context of human rights law. It has to be interpreted with other branch kicking in, so that it ensures better justice for humanity, and secondly, it can lead to better enforcement, right? So these are some of the points that I like to highlight here. There are other points which I want to discuss in detail, but with paucity of time, and I would like to take a lot of questions from your end so that I could give my views. So you have any questions to ask, you're free to ask. Yeah, thank you.
Sir, there is two questions from Nipun. First one is, can conflicts with terrorists be classified as IAC, given that there is no involvement of two states?
Okay. Now, in the year 2007, if I'm right, in the year 2016, the International Humanitarian Law Commentary. This is a book that every student who goes for Henry Dunant Moot. Henry Dunant Moot is one of the premier moots on international humanitarian law, and this is the only moot on international humanitarian law. That is somewhat unfortunate. We are not giving much emphasis on international humanitarian law, unlike other branches like constitutional law. So, to answer your question, whether I'll give an example for this. Let's say United States attacks a target in Afghanistan, let's say Al Qaeda, which is a non-state actor. So his question was whether this comes under the definition of non-international armed conflict, and that essentially depends on whether Afghanistan gives consent to the attack. Let's say Afghanistan gives consent to United States that you could attack this non-state entity, which is so-called terrorist organization, then essentially that would be non-international armed conflict. Without Afghanistan giving consent to United States, unilaterally, if US attacks the so-called belligerent or insurgent, then it will be international armed conflict. I mean, there are basically two schools of thought. One school which says it's essentially international armed conflict because there is an international actor. And the other school say the conflict is essentially territorial, in a sense it's happening within a state. So US is not being attacked, right? It's not, tit for tat. So it's one-way traffic. So it's a non-international armed. So it all boils down to the consent given by the state in which the group is present, right?
Yes, thank you, sir. The second question is, can a group be called a non-liberation movement even if it is working in association with the terrorists but satisfies the conditions which you said earlier?
Okay, this is a wonderful question that is posed, and very complex and technical question, and very difficult question to answer. So the answer that I would give here is, I would ask I'm not sure who posed that question,
So
to
Nipun,
read, to refer to Article 1, Paragraph 4 of the Additional Protocol 1. Now, when there is a iota of doubt with regard to the involvement of terrorist group, you need to understand that post 9/11, I would categorize this into two categories: post 9/11 and pre 9/11. Post 9/11, there was not much discussion on terrorism. Pre 9/11, that is pre 9/11. Post 9/11, United States sponsored multiple resolutions in the United Nations Security Council. One resolution that I starkly remember is Resolution 1368, 1373. These are some of the resolutions which categorically states that states have to take all measures to curb terrorism. This might include financing of terrorism, to curbing terrorist attacks or terrorist acts within their states or borders. Now, India is bound by the Security Council resolution because in India we have a specific act, the Security Council Act of 1947. So let's now post 9/11, even if there is an iota of doubt that a group is a terrorist organization, states are given liberty to attack. This is what happened in case of LTTE. LTTE had a very strong backing pre 9/11. They occupied certain portions of Sri Lanka and they were matching Sri Lankan government. But post 9/11, because of multiple UNSC resolution against terrorism, the entire I would say philosophy on terrorism changed, and states started viewing terrorism as a threat. And this was sponsored by the United States, right? United States had a major role to play. And in the name of terrorism, in the name of national security, states are violating human rights. This is another point that needs to be looked into. States would say you are a terrorist organization, they'll brand you as a terrorist organization, and they'll violate human rights. So how do you reconcile terrorism and human rights? How do you reconcile terrorism and non-international armed conflict? It's something now I feel it's tilted in favor of the state. States have to take the ultimate call. And post 9/11, you have the fall of LTT, right? It was post 9/11 the LTT started to fall. That is because of strict sanctions in the Security Council. So it depends on the factual matrix. It depends on the factual matrix, and it also depends on who has taken cognizance of the situation with regard to a conflict. For instance, if the matter is taken by the Security Council, it has a higher weightage. When a matter is taken by the General Assembly, again, it has a very less threshold compared to a matter being taken up by the security. And secondly, it also depends on the states involved. If the state is the United States, you have a higher chances of naming an entity as a terrorist organization. If the state, let's say, is a smaller third world state, again, it will be intensely debated, and national interest ultimately plays a role, right? Yeah.
If anyone else want to ask any question, please post it in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. So there is one more question for
Yeah.
Nipun. How far are intelligence reports reliable?
Now, I'll answer your question in the context of international humanitarian law. In the context of international humanitarian law, the report that international courts would look into is the reports of the UN bodies, what you call as expert bodies under the United Nations. For instance, when the genocide happened in Sri Lanka, United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed a panel of experts to look into the war crimes in Sri Lanka. The panel recommended setting up of international inquiry, but till now there has not been an inquiry into the violations that happened in Sri Lanka. So the at the jurisprudential front, for any development that has to happen, it is the United Nations that has to take into cognizance the conflict or a dispute. I'll give you an example in case of Myanmar. In case of Myanmar, there's an ongoing case in the International Court of Justice, wherein there is an accusation made by Gambia against Myanmar. There was a gross violation of the Genocide Convention. Now, if you read the provisional measure given by the International Court of Justice, you'll understand that the International Court of Justice has relied extensively on the UN reports. And to answer your question, it all boils down to who is the author of the report. If the author of the report is the UN, United Nations, or the expert body under the UN appointed by the Secretary General or the Security Council, or the report flows from International Fact-Finding Commission, it has a greater weightage. And this basically prompts me to take you to a different zone altogether. That is how evidence is gauged in international dispute settlement forum. This is a very, very acute area of research, and there are plenty of writings on this. For instance, I remember reading a couple of days back an article read by Ospina. Ospina was a former registrar of the International Court of Justice. He writes an article, 13-page article, if I'm right, on evidence before International Court of Justice. So newspaper cuttings are not taken as a credible or primary evidence. The primary evidence essentially flows from International Fact-Finding Commission. It flows from the expert opinions given by the human rights bodies. Thirdly, it also flows from state practice. State practice is very important. When I say state practice, the practice has to be justified or legitimized by the higher authorities in the government. So that is basically state practice. So essentially, ICC looks into, now with regard to this with regard to ICJ. With regard to ICC, the modus operandi is somewhat different. In case of ICC, the International Criminal Court examines the witnesses. So there is something like PW1, what you find in the domestic courts. With regard to international criminal tribunals, witnesses are examined. Based on the testimony given by the witnesses, a decision is reached. For instance, there's a very important case in the International Criminal Tribunal, that is the prosecutor versus Jelicic, Goran Jelicic, the prosecutor versus Jean Paul Akanda. All these cases are testimony to the fact that how witnesses play a very important role in International Criminal Tribunal. But the problem here is, how do you ensure witness protection? This is again a matter of intense jurisprudential writings, but I'm not venturing into that. But to answer your question, the intelligence report, it all boils down to from which source it is coming from, right? That plays a very important role in any dispute settlement forum, right? Yeah.
So there's one more question from Nipun. If based on an intelligence report of its own country, a country takes action against the group leader of terrorists in another country and brings him to his country, would that be violative of IHL?
Now, the question that you posed is essentially a question with regard to extradition. Extradition in international law. Now, when I discuss extradition, it all depends on the nature of the crime. Now, let's say the terrorist group or an individual is accused of committing torture, and torture is a crime that is prohibited, outrightly prohibited under international law. And we have a specific convention on torture, that is the Convention Against Torture, the 1986 Convention. This particular convention talks about the principle of either extradite or prosecute. So I'll give an example. I'll give you a very clear example to make the point crystal clear, that when you might be aware of Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann was accused of committing Holocaust during World War II in Germany. So Israel was placing a high bounty on his head. So subsequently, they were able to trace him 20 years after post-World War II in Argentina. So the Israeli secret agency, I think it's Mossad. So they went to Argentina, captured him, and he was put to trial in Israel, and he was subsequently hanged. So again, it depends on the power politics. Who is at the receiving end of the stick? Let's say you have a situation involving United States. US undertook an Operation Geronimo, and captured Osama, right? Now, whether India would be able to do that in a foreign soil, on the one hand, you have US, on the other hand, you have India. So power dynamics plays a very crucial role in determining who is brought and who is not brought, right? Now, I could also remember there are a lot of leaders who are accused of gross human rights violation, grave violations, who are still absconding law. I can give you the example of the famous leader of Uganda, right? Idi Amin, right? Idi Amin was accused of committing gross violations, right? So international community was a silent spectator to that, and subsequently he got exiled in UK. He died peacefully, I think 10-15 years back. So no action was taken, right? So again, it all depends on whose rights are affected and whose rights are involved. And I could invoke a lot of regimes which are dictatorial. If you read the history of Haiti, Haiti is a country in I think Central America. They had a very notorious dictator by the name John Bua. So he was governing Haiti for a period of 20-30 years, and he was getting funds from the United States, right? Now, he was accused of committing various violations. Now, no action was taken by the international community because the interest of the larger countries are very minimum. But when you when you say countries like Iran, Iraq, Saudi, you have larger interest in play, right? For instance, in Middle East, you have oil diplomacy. Oil diplomacy is the cause of crisis that you witness today in Middle East. So it all depends on national interest. This is a very important phrase that I would like to point out. National interest. So national interest is one of the roadblocks to the enforcement of international law. So ultimately, it's the national interest of the powerful states that trumps the smaller state. Now, with regard to India, we are playing a very, very neutral role. We are not willing to flex our muscle against uh, um, powerful states, although we say we want to go to war with China, in reality, it's only in rhetoric. In reality, I don't think it will materialize. And India is acting only with the I mean, with an impression that the US would support them, as it happened in Doklam when US had actively supported India's cause. So India individually cannot target a powerful state. It has to have the backing, right? So again, it all depends on the state, right?
If anyone else want to ask any question, please send it in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. I will unmute you. If anyone want to ask, please ask. We are already running out of time.
You have a question to ask, Varun?
No,
There's
sir.
something to ask? Okay,
There is feedback like all good for me, etc.
fine, fine.
I'm announcing it last time that please, if anyone want to ask, please ask it. Otherwise, we will end the session. So I think nobody wants to ask any question.
Fine, fine.
Okay.
So
So
I would like to thank Varun for the invitation. This is a topic that I'm just into researching. This is a subject that I've never taught for my students. The branch of law that I teach my students is essentially public international law, human rights law, and refugee law. So in a way, this is a plunge that I've taken when I was discussing concepts in international humanitarian law. And in the course of discussion, or in the course of my preparation on international humanitarian law, I would I could identify a lot of gray areas that requires to be addressed. And ultimately, states have a very larger interest or role to play in addressing or mitigating or bridging the gap. So in a way, international humanitarian law at the present point is dysfunctional against the powerful states. Now again, I can take you back to the example of US. US yesterday had a gumption or to pass sanctions against the prosecutor of International Criminal Court and the judges of International Criminal Court. Now you cannot imagine such a scenario 10 or 15 years back. I would not equate this sanctions with the sanctions to the judges of International Court of Justice. So if this trend continues, US would have US would point its gun against the judges of International Court of Justice. This could also happen. So we need to introspect whether in which direction we are heading when we discuss these kind of areas. And I only hope that there are a lot of discussions on international humanitarian law. There are very scant literature by Indians on international humanitarian law. Most of the literature that stems or comes from is from Geneva or countries like France, UK. They write extensively on international humanitarian law. But we or our practice on international humanitarian law is confined to Delhi, and we hardly have 3-4 good scholars who I think who propagate the subject international humanitarian law. So what I feel is, if you end up taking international law as your subject of specialization, international humanitarian law would be a good area to research on, because there are plenty of gray areas to be worked with. Now at this point, I want to register a point. Now, during this COVID-19 situation, we discuss incessantly about a lot of things. And constitution we see is the mother document or the grand norm. Of course, I agree with that. But an emphasis or is to be given to some specific aspect of international humanitarian law, right, and other branches of international law. As of now, I only see people in Delhi, hardly 2-3 scholars from Delhi working on these areas. And this has meant that our participation in these international institutions are very minimal. And unless we participate in the institutional framework, we cannot be termed as a global power, right? So practice of these kinds of subject can go a long way. I'll tell you something. I read something today in a blog written. It's something like a first post. You might be aware of this. The first post. There was something written on that. So the title of the article read, um, U.S. sanctions international criminal ICJ. Now, I'm not sure who authored it, but the author was on the impression that ICC, or the International Criminal Court, and the International Court of Justice are the same. So this is where we are in. This is the position we are in, that we do not know the complexities of international law, and still we are interpreting international law, which can be a dangerous proposition and which can send a very wrong signal to the international community. So what I feel is we need to actively participate in the discourse of international humanitarian law so that our voice is recognized at the global front, right? So I would like to thank Varun for this opportunity, and hope all of you are safe and continue learning branches like international humanitarian law or human rights law. We unduly give a lot of emphasis to trade law, economic law, arbitration, which is an upcoming area, but we are distancing ourselves from such areas which affect human life. And these branches of law, the source of these branches are the blood of the victims, right? This is something that I tell my students. Human rights law, humanitarian law, international criminal law, the real source is not the statute book that you study. The source is the blood of the victim. So essentially you are addressing them, right? Whenever you articulate, you are articulating on behalf of them, right? You are an ambassador for them, right? So when, let's say, people tend to go to Europe for conference, etc., I feel we need to go to Africa. We need to go to African countries and discuss international humanitarian law and international criminal law per se, because that is where the real practice of international humanitarian law happens. But the discussion happens only in Europe, but the practice happens in African states. So let's say you have a conference to attend in Africa, go there, present a paper on humanitarian law. It's a contribution that you make, right? Right. The atrocities, we have forgotten that. The genocide in Rwanda, killed nearly 2 million people. And we talk about Paris attack, right? I'm not demeaning any kind of terrorist act, but the thing is, see the conflicts in an equal footing, right? When Rwandan genocide happened, millions and millions of people died. Clinton administration was silent. It did not intervene. But when you have war in Yemen, when the interest of Saudi is at stake, US is ready to supply weapons, right, to the Sheikh of Saudi. So again, how you see international politics in all this. This is something that is very fascinating and that needs to be looked into, and international law per se should not be secluded from politics. So again, I would like to thank Varun for providing me this platform, and all the participants who actively participated in the course of this presentation and discussion. Thank you. And yeah, you have any further questions you can pose, or I can stop.
Yes, sir. There are some questions.
Okay.
First from Naga. Sir, can you explain genocide?
Okay. So genocide is a crime that is not strictly confined to international humanitarian law. Although there are provisions under humanitarian law that talks about genocide, genocide has a very specific convention. That is the 1948 Genocide Convention, right? This is a very peculiar convention because this is the only convention that defines the term genocide. And when the convention was put into place, uh, states were very skeptical, and states felt that this convention will not materialize or operationalized. Now, I'll tell you some of the provisions under the convention. Now, one of the provisions to prove genocide is mens rea and actus rea. And genocide is something that is targeting a particular categories of individuals who fall under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Racial discrimination. So people who fall or fit into the category of the definition of genocide would be beneficiary of this convention. But there were two cases in the ICJ with regard to the Genocide Convention. The Bosnia Serbia case in the ICJ, the 93 case, and the subsequent judgment in the year 2007 involving Croatia and Serbia. In both these cases, although the violation involved genocide, the ICJ had said that the threshold of proving genocide is very high. The threshold for proving genocide is specific intent. So unless a state is able to establish that there is a specific intent to target a group or a group, genocide can never be proven. So my problem with the entire genocide thing is the yardstick for proving genocide is very high. What you call as dolus specialis. Specific intent has to be proven by the state. And the second defect I see in the genocide convention, the 1948 convention, is the convention does not talk anything on reparations. The genocide convention says if so and so is violated, the states have so and so recourse. But none of the provisions under the genocide convention talks about reparations to the victims or the state. Now, how do you categorize genocide? This is quite fascinating. Genocide, I would say, is arguably one of the few crimes that fits into state as well as individual liability. So now I'll tell you an example. Let's say environmental law violations fall under the category of state's obligation. It does not talk anything about international responsibility. But when I say genocide, it fits into the category of state responsibility as well as individual responsibility, right? So individual can be tried for crimes of genocide, right? When I say individual, the head of the states can be tried for the crimes of genocide, and even the states can be tried for the crimes of genocide. But this might not be true with branches like environmental law, where the larger actor are the states. So in a way, this genocide itself is a very unique thing because it applies both to the states and individual. Now, there are a lot of cases involving African states. For instance, the former head of the state of, I think, Rwanda, if I'm right, Jean Paul, I think his name is, I forgot, Akayesu, Jean Paul Akayesu. There's a case in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. The prosecutor is a Jean Paul Akayesu. And this particular case had categorically said that rape would constitute genocide. So although you have a threshold in the Genocide Convention, 1948 Convention, the expanse or the interpretation of genocide has been expanding. Now, I remember one of my students is writing a paper on cultural genocide. Cultural genocide is something that is not defined under the Genocide Convention, right? There are 5 categories which are given under the Genocide Convention. Only if these categories are breached, the convention kicks in. Now, the other point to be noted with regard to the Genocide Convention is, this is the Human Rights Convention. This is also very important. This is a Human Rights Convention. So in the year 1948, there was an advisory opinion asked to the International Court of Justice, whether the provisions under the Genocide Convention can be reserved by the state. There was an advisory opinion requested by the organs of the UN to the International Court of Justice. The ICJ had said the object and purpose of the Genocide Convention should not be reserved, and Genocide Convention talks about human values, morality, etc. So even International Court of Justice in the genocide reservations case in the ICJ has acknowledged the fact that this convention is a sacrosanct convention, and this convention stands out from the other human rights convention. And to add to the point that I mentioned, genocide violation is a just cogens norm violation. Right. There are only 8 crimes in international law, which is 8 concepts which have attained the status of just cogens, and genocide is one such concept. Right. So by that, you would be in a position to appreciate the relevance of just cogence in modern international law. So if anyone is willing to read on just cogence, I would request them to, okay, of course, you need to start off with the Nuremberg trials. But before that, you should read the book of Raphael Lemkin. Raphael Lemkin, Raphael Lemkin. Raphael Lemkin, he is the one who coined the term genocide, and he has written a book on genocide. Before this book was instrumental in the enactment of the Genocide Convention. So it would be interesting to see the ongoing case in the ICJ, Gambia versus Myanmar, because the board of contention in the case is Genocide Convention, right? So within a couple of years, we'll know what is the stance taken by the International Court of Justice. But with regard to ICC, the point is very clear. Genocide is prohibited, right? Under Article 5 or 6 of the Rome Statute. Fine.
So there are three more questions. First one is from Nipun.
Okay.
Is prisoner of war concept applicable to terrorists like Al Qaeda?
Now, prisoners depends on how you categorize Al Qaeda. Let's say Al Qaeda is a terrorist organization. You brand them as a terrorist organization. Now, Al Qaeda is a terrorist organization because of the UNSC resolution. There are certain UNSC resolutions which brand Al Qaeda as a terrorist organization. So, by virtue of the UNSC resolution, they are terrorist group. And for terrorist organizations or entity, prisoners of war status is not conferred, and the third Geneva Convention is not applicable to them. Fine. With, let's say, assuming that Al Qaeda, Lashkar-e-Taiba are not terrorist organization, they are fighting for a just cause, they are a resistance movement, then prisoners of war status would be applicable to them. But the issue in hand is there is a very fine balance. How do you categorize a terrorist organization from a state which is fighting for a just cause? Now, let's say, assuming that, let's say myself and 20, 30 of my students, we go to the streets and we protest against the state of India. We protest against India. Now, the state would automatically brand me as terrorist, right? But for me, I'm fighting for liberation. So it all depends on who views it, and it all depends ultimately on the SC resolution. So again, I would say, I'll emphasize this point. It all depends on the factual matrix, the ground reality, and of course the state involved, right? Al Qaeda attacked the Twin Towers, so they are terrorists. Let's assuming that they attacked some remote part of Africa, the matter would not have been brought before the Security Council. I'll give you another example with regard to COVID-19. With regard to COVID-19, when there was an Ebola outbreak, right? UNSC passed a resolution. But when there was this, COVID-19 outbreak, UNSC failed to pass a resolution. So again, it all depends on the interest of the states, right? Yeah.
There is another question from Apeksha. What protection is provided to refugees and minorities under international law?
Refugee, you are forcing me to take me to a separate corpus altogether. That is the Convention on the Status of Refugee, the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugee. So under the definition of refugees, there are certain categories of persons who are protected. For instance, anyone who's persecuted based on race, religion, nationality, these categories are protected under the definition of under the definition of refugee. But the problem with this definition is it's not an exhaustive definition. For instance, gender is not covered under refugee, the definition of refugee. Let's say, I'll give an example. Let's say there is domestic violation, and the affected individual goes to other state for seeking refugee status. The individual will not be given the refugee status because the individual is not covered under the definition of refugee. The other thing is climate refugee. The convention does not define who is a climate refugee. So again, the 1951 convention is an outdated convention. This convention has not been amended even once. So protection, that is to answer your question specifically, the protection that is given to refugees are, if you ask me, it all depends on the domestic legislation in place. For instance, India has not signed the Refugee Convention, right? India is not sign, has not. India, I think, has do not have a specific act for refugees. India does not have an act or legislation for refugees. So all the refugees who come to India are protected on an ad hoc basis. They are protected based on administrative measures. So what I feel is, with regard to India, India has to sign the Refugee Convention, and it has to subsequently go through the litmus test in the parliament, and we need to have specific legislation in place. And the protection, although it's granted under the Refugee Convention, is minuscule, because there are a lot of categories which are not covered under the definition. And the state responsibility when it comes to Refugee Convention is very limited. For instance, Article 38 of the Refugee Convention says, if the rights of the refugees are violated, the International Court of Justice is the appropriate forum. But the irony here is, only states can be parties to the International Court of Justice, right? Now, a refugee who's affected cannot file a case before the ICJ. So how do you mitigate that? Whether refugees would be represented by any state? So these are some of the challenges that needs to be addressed in the context of state responsibility vis-a-vis refugee law. As of now, it's the domestic courts which ensures that the rights of the refugees are protected. And of course, you have a body called as UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugee. Of course, this organization, like ICRC, works under the auspice of the state. Fine, thank you.
So the next question is from Sumita. Sir, can you please state the effectiveness of fact finding or evidence collection into the affairs of our sovereign states?
Can you come again? Just a second. Yeah.
Yes, sir. It's can you please state the effectiveness of fact finding or evidence collection into the affairs of our sovereign states?
Okay. Now, since you raise a very pertinent question with regard to International Fact-Finding Commission, International Fact-Finding Commission is codified under Additional Protocol 1, Article 89 or 90. You can cross-check that. International Fact-Finding Commission are basically commissions which are set up when there is a human rights or humanitarian violations that has happened. Now, I can give an example with regard to Israel-Palestine. The 6-year war that happened, the Yom Kippur War, the 1967 war, which happened between Israel and Palestine. Subsequently, there was an International Fact-Finding Commission, and the commission accused both Israel and Palestine for committing various kinds of human rights violations. Now, these International Fact-Finding Commission have a limited mandate, and the mandate only materializes only if the state gives consent. Let's say there is an International Fact-Finding Commission that is set up by the UN to look into the atrocities in Kashmir. Now, only if the government of India permits the entry of the UN Fact-Finding Commission, that International Fact-Finding Commission will have jurisdiction. Otherwise, it will not have jurisdiction in stricto sensu. Now, assuming, I'll take the example of COVID-19 and China. Assuming that there is an International Fact-Finding Commission set up against China, a kind of commission of inquiry. Now, this commission can only inquire with the approval of China. And that is unlikely, because China has a very dubious track record when it comes to international institutions. I think I've written something on this in South China Morning Post. Maybe if anyone is interested, you can go through it. It's a small piece on how China is backtracking on international institutions. So this, again, this is again an interesting case study, how China has seen international law. When I teach my students international law, I tell my students to know the perspectives. We see international law from 2-3 books, Malcolm Shaw, Stark, which are essentially books from UK, right? Now, we rarely or seldomly see the perspective of international law from the prism of China or Russia. So if anyone is interested, you can read this book. Book is titled, Is International Law International? This book was written by Anthea Roberts. Is International Law International? Anthea Roberts. She traces the practice of Russian practice of international law. Russia sees use of force differently from what we commonly associate with use of force. Russia sees self-defense to be a different concept. So the problem today is in our academy, as we are only focused on one particular perspective of international. So it's high time that we accommodate, we embrace other views of international law. And Chinese views of international law are very radical. especially in the fields of law of sea, especially in the domain like law of sea, where their position is totally different from the UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on Law of Sea. So my point is we need to accommodate all these perspectives, and we need to arrive at a common solution. Right now, what I say is we are dominated. We are head starting international law only with the European conception, right? We only see international from a Westphalian point of view. This trend has to change, and sovereignty has become one of the stumbling blocks to enforce international law. And it's unfortunate in International Court of Justice we see everything is based on consent, right? Consent establishes jurisdiction, so we need to overcome this consensual regime, right? Fine. Yeah.
Yes, there's no new question, sir.
Okay.
If anyone want to ask, please ask it within 30 seconds. No, sir, there's no question. I think we should end the session.
Okay, so
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, sir. First of all, I would like thank you for giving your valuable time for this session. Yes, sir. There's no question, sir. Should we end the session?
Yeah, we could end the session, and I would like to get the feedback of the session.
Yes, sir.
So that
sure.
I can also improve on my teaching methodology on the areas that I'm focusing on. So
Sure.
thank you for the opportunity.
My
Hope
pleasure.
we organize more such events. This can be a kind of academic dissemination of knowledge, right? Thank you.
Yes. If anyone want to send his or her feedback, please mail me at info@lawaudience.com. Thank you to all the participants for joining this session, and we will end the session now. Thank you, sir.
Fine. Thank you.
Okay.